Welcome into the complete opening guide for beginners. Also, I'll share with you common errors that cost people games and annoying losses. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The very first opening task is to control the center. If you control the center, you control the game. Lots of players have heard about this rule, but let me share exactly why it is so important. Let's say you start the game and usually you push one of your central pawns forward exactly to occupy those central squares. Now, what are they? They are these four central squares right in the middle of the board, and they have the greatest importance for you. For that reason, we either play pawn e4 or pawn d4. Let's say we go pawn d4 and your opponent just tries to develop his pieces, which seems to be fine as well. However, at the very same moment, he neglects the center, and therefore you can keep grabbing the center, pawn e4. Let's say your opponent continues developing and you keep grabbing the center. Now your opponent wants to bring up the knight and then the castle, but you can already play pawn to e5. And at this point you can already see how strong your position is just because you occupy the center. First of all, your pawns themselves control a whole lot of squares on the board. But on top of that, thanks to this space advantage, your other pieces are also controlling lots of important lines and diagonals. And just based on the volume of errors that I've drawn here, you can see how great your domination already is just within a couple moves of you occupying the center of the board. For example, what can black do in this particular case? If they move their knight all the way back to g8, well, they can castle after that and they kind of undevelop their knight, so it's probably not what they want. If they try to move it forward to e4, you can actually play f3 and notice that your pawns are taking away pretty much all the squares where this knight could possibly go to, plus your bishop is taking away this final square on g5, and therefore this knight is lost in the middle of the board. Let's take it back. What if this knight goes to g4 or to h5? Well, it's all the same stuff. You can go pawn g4 and the knight is still trapped. Pawn is attacking this knight, this pawn takes away this square, your bishop takes away this square, therefore the knight has nowhere to go and will be lost on the next move. That once again illustrates the power of the center and how dominative your position becomes. Now let's have a look at one more example when white similarly tried to occupy some central squares just as well. And here after knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, white still develops, black goes pawn to e5 here in this position, and now you grab the center. So that's the ideal position that you want to achieve, ideally speaking, when you have two pawns right in the middle of the board. And white played here pawn d4 to challenge the center. Now we did not want to just trade off, because in this case that would lead to just a symmetric position in the center, but we want to dominate, want to occupy the center. Therefore, instead of the exchange, you can push your pawn forward and now you have more space. Also, this pawn on e4 chases this knight away from f3 and therefore it has to go. Knight to d2. You can already see that white's position is somewhat cramped a little bit and it's harder for white to move around. While for you it is the opposite case. You have more space and therefore it's very easy for you to bring your pieces anywhere you want. Well, for example, we go knight f6. And then let's say both sides continue developing their pieces, white castles, and all of a sudden, boom, bishop takes h2. This great gift sacrifice wins the game. And it may seem like just a sudden tactical opportunity, but in reality you can see that thanks to the strong center, first of all, we kicked off this knight from f3. If white's knight won f3 still, this sacrifice would never work, white would just capture with their knight. Secondly, you could develop your bishop to d6 on the first place to deliver this final blow on h2, while white could not put their bishop on d3 symmetrically because of your pawn controlling this square. So your center actually plays a huge role here. Even after king to h2, we go knight g4 check. Once again, your knight could stand on f6, and so it could easily go forward. After king to g1, now your queen has a lot of freedom to go places to go and use different routes to attack the king. For example, here queen h4 just wins the game because there is no defense. White has to guard these both squares and he can't, so you win the game. That's how your domination in the center allows you to transfer your successful attack on the side. You might be thinking at this point, well, Igor, everybody knows that you gotta control the center. Well, then let me share with you the most common errors that make people violate this rule. One of them here, if we go into the Scotch game after d4, pawn takes, knight takes d4, the most common move here on amateur level is knight takes d4. And it may not seem like an error, but just an exchange. But as a result of that, what happens is you can see that white is fully controlling the center, and that's exactly what we want. And black has just helped white to achieve that by his own move knight takes d4. So knight takes d4 allowed white to dominate the center, and that is why it is wrong. Now, in this case, we do not have two pawns in the middle of the board, but basically we're happy to have whatever in the middle of the board. It can be pawns or pieces. We're happy either way. And now you can already see that it's getting a little bit difficult for black to develop normally. They cannot develop their bishop from f8 because now it has to guard this square g7. If black tries to move their knight forward to f6, you can kick it off immediately with this move pawn e5, and the knight has to go back. So knight f6 is not an option. In most cases, black plays d6 just to stop this pawn from moving forward, and although it is a normal move for black to play, it's still a little bit passive. It also locks this bishop behind the pawn so that it does not control this open diagonal anymore. Anyway, let's go next. Let's say we now develop knight c3, knight f6. Now white can develop his bishop to a very active position on g5 where it puts pressure. Black has to put his bishop on the most passive square where it has literally nowhere to go. Now we castle queenside. Let's say black castles, and now we can already use his central advantage to just go into a straightforward attack with pawn e5. It's just one of the ways for white. And after the pawn trade, you can see that black's already in trouble. White is putting pressure along all these diagonals, and it's already quite tough for black to play. You could see how this seemingly little insignificant mistake by conceding the center allowed white to mount this huge attack within just a couple moves. Let me share with you one more example. Here's the Queen's Gambit, one of the most classical chess openings. Quite often black is unfamiliar with the opening theory, and therefore they decide to play a simple move, and they take here on c4. Now at first, why not to capture the pawn? It's hanging, it's undefended, why not to take it? Black does not realize that they are in fact giving up the center, and they potentially allow white to occupy it by playing pawn e4, getting this ideal center of the board. The issue here is that the negative consequences of giving up the center are usually seen several moves down the road. Like right now it doesn't seem like black's in trouble, although they can very well become in trouble within a couple moves. Let's see how it goes. Let's say again black does not know an opening theory, he just wants to play simple chess. So he plays pawn e6. Now white picks up the pawn, and black starts developing knight c6, attacks the pawn, white goes knight f3, defends it with the other knight, black goes knight f6, so far so good, both sides develop, bishop b4, develops a bishop, also pins this knight down, therefore knight takes e4 becomes possible. Again, so far looks like black is having a completely normal game, but nevertheless, white has these two pawns in the center of the board, and black has nothing. Now white goes pawn e5, let's say, to attack this knight. Knight e4, black is threatening here. Let's say white develops. I'm just playing most common moves actually that players typically play, just to show you what's going to happen a couple moves down the road. Now we are in the early middle game phase, okay? And if you look at this pawn barrier, it helps white to get a lot of space for his pieces, for his maneuvers, and it also cuts off black's pieces. For instance, this bishop has nowhere to go really, right? Here it can take. If it goes here, once again, it just hits the wall, right? This pawn wall in the middle of the board. Similarly, this knight from c6 cannot really go anywhere, right? Because of all these pawns. This bishop from c8 has a hard time being developed, right? On d7 it's passive, it goes b6, followed by bishop b7, now this bishop on a5 is completely locked. You see that black is somewhat uncomfortable already, while white has lots of options. And it's all thanks to these three pawns in the middle of the board. Moreover, white can even rush into the attack right away with the move knight to g5, hitting this pawn. The only way to defend it would be g6, but white can still continue his attack, queen h3, threatening this checkmate. If black goes pawn h5 to defend it, there are different ways to attack it. Even white can break open the position with g4, aiming to get to the king anyway, and either to take here, or if black captures, there is queen to h7 checkmate. Notice how black couldn't use all these pieces because they are cut off by white's center. The second most important opening rule is to develop your minor pieces quickly. And once again, you might be thinking, well, come on, everybody's aware of that. Well, there are some pitfalls here. So, for example, here, let's say white goes pawn f4, offering this gambit pawn, and after that bishop c4, getting black a little bit out of theory. Now, what do black play here? In most cases, they play queen h4 because they notice an opportunity to attack the king. After king to f1, black wants to follow up with bishop c5, hoping to deliver this kind of fool's checkmate on f2. Now it goes pawn d4 to shut it down, as well as to attack the bishop has to go back, white goes knight f3, this time hitting this queen. Black realizes that if the queen goes away, white will be able to get their pawn back, and black achieved nothing with his attack. And therefore he wants to at least hold on to this extra pawn so that he gets something for his attacking attempt. Now white goes knight c3, and white keeps developing their minor pieces. Now knight to d5 is coming, and that's annoying. It attacks the queen and everything around basically. Therefore black thinks, okay, let me cover that square by playing pawn to c6. By the way, notice that black is playing very reactively instead of thinking about the principles of opening play. Because if we know that in an opening you gotta develop pieces, then that's what you should do, right? Even if you want to cover this square, it's better to develop a knight and cover that square simultaneously, rather than just play c6 while all these pieces are still dozing on their original squares. Now I can play pawn e5 and white keeps attacking. Black once again wants to hold on to this pawn on f4, that's why they play queen to f5. And white keeps chasing the queen away, queen g4, now pawn h3, the only square now available is queen to g3, and right here white can already play knight to e2, and the queen is trapped here on g3, white's winning. There is also one little bit interesting fact here. You can see that black's moves here throughout this game were pretty much all wrong. And I'm not sharing with you some weird, unusual game. No, it's right the opposite. These are the most common moves of black, in fact. So you can see how easy it is to win when your opponents are just clueless of what to do. Another easy way for you to outsmart your opponent and to get ahead in development is to sacrifice a pawn for quick development. For example, you can do that right away with d5, pawn takes, and knight f6. You don't get your pawn right away, you instead continue to develop. And many of your opponents may wish to think, hey, I can actually defend this pawn by playing pawn to c4, and now I'm a pawn up. But you say, okay, and you just keep developing. You play pawn to c6, threatening to get the pawn back so that if they want to save it, they have to trade on c6. And now you already have a bunch of pieces in the game while white is completely passive. So that strategy works actually in pretty much any opening. You sacrifice a little pawn to get ahead in development to start your attack early. So for example, they play knight f3, now pawn e5. And white is already feeling uncomfortable because e4 is coming to chase away this knight. They may play pawn d3 trying to stop you from doing so, but you push in the center of the board anyway. And now after pawn takes and queen takes d1, you force the king to move. And after knight takes e4, you threaten knight takes f2, fork to the king and rook. You can already feel how your advantage in development allows you to start creating this attack. If white wants to save this pawn, they probably play bishop e3. Yeah, play bishop f5, you continue developing, you are ready to castle queenside and to continue attacking. White may feel uncomfortable, may wish to hide their king, but then you castle, and your advantage in development is getting larger and larger. After bishop e2, another good piece of advice here is to trade off opponents' already developed pieces, so that they're left over with all the passive pieces only. Okay, so we can go bishop c5 here, trading off this one. After this exchange on c5, I mean, you don't have to remember all these moves, of course, as this is just an example, to illustrate the general opening principle that works in different openings. And now after knight c3, white's problem is that his rooks are out of the game, his position is passive. Black played here knight b4, aiming to attack the king. White tried knight h4, hoping to get rid of this bishop. But let this be our puzzle of the day. It is black to play, and if you can find a good move for black, please write it down in the comments below. Let me share with you one more example of the same strategy, how you sacrifice a pawn to take lead in development. Here in this standard position, you can play pawn d4, sacrificing this pawn, and then you don't try to get it back instantly, instead you just want to keep developing. So you play bishop c4, thanks to this pawn sacrifice you have this new diagonal for your bishop, which is nice, and you can consider taking this pawn back later. Say black goes knight f6, once again you just castle. Many of your opponents will play bishop c5, trying to develop the bishop and hold on to this pawn on d4, but we don't worry about that. And now you can already start attacking. This knight has to go, where can it go? If it goes to g8, it's just passive, right? Black can't castle after that, it's pretty bad. If it goes to e4, you can keep attacking this knight, and it actually doesn't really have any square to go to, because you're controlling the square on g5 just as well. Therefore, black can be in trouble. What if the knight goes to g4? Well, there's also a pretty interesting move here that you can play. It's the move pawn to c3. You threaten to capture this pawn, and black may think that you keep playing just to, activate your knight, but instead, you've got a winning blow, bishop takes f7. And after king takes, knight to g5, check to the king. Now you can also, on the next move, get back this knight on g4. But in this game, black played king g8, which allowed white to finish the game even sooner. So instead of queen g4, now white just played queen d5 check, which resulted into this quick checkmate. So thanks to a little pawn sacrifice earlier in the game with a pawn d4, white got ahead in development and could start playing forward moves, attacking moves, which resulted into this quick checkmate. The third most important opening principle is to castle early. This puts your king to safety, as well as this helps you to activate your rook. Ideally, you want to castle within the first 5 moves, but at least within the first 10 moves. So for example, in this position of the Ruy Lopez opening, you can already castle right here. In the game we're analyzing, instead of doing the same and aiming to castle quickly, black decided to grab this pawn in the center, known as the Berlin defense. Anyway, white played rook e1, starting to put some pressure here. The knight went back. White took this pawn on e5, and here black decided to trade. Once again, what do you do when you don't know an opening theory? Well, you develop pieces and you castle quickly, right? So black still could have played b7 and castle. He instead decided to take on e5. And remember, it was one of the common errors that we talked about previously. To take is a mistake. Very often when your opponent takes something, he rather abandons the center by giving up the only piece that actually influenced the center really, and it allows you to become more active. So here after knight takes e5, black was hoping that white would recapture with a rook, but white played a smaller move, pawn to d4, aiming to recapture the knight with a pawn, which will keep attacking the other knight on f6. And the knight can now go away because of this pin, and in fact black is already losing the game. It's hard to believe that. Within just 5 or 6 moves in the game, playing seemingly natural moves. But in the game he decided to counterattack, but pawn takes e5 anyway was very annoying for black, and here after they continued trading, it turned out that this rook attacks the king, and there is no normal way to cover that. The only way is to give up the bishop, but after that white can win easily, and white is already up a piece and will probably checkmate black soon. Most chess players know that they need to castle early in the game, so how do you tempt them in not doing that? Well, we can use our favorite strategy, sacrifice one little pawn to make black deviate from the right path. For example, in the queen's gambit, instead of playing pawn c4, you can gambit another pawn on e4. After black takes it, you go knight c3 and attack this pawn. Black wants to defend it with their own knight, and you play pawn f3, attacking the pawn for the second time. They may think, okay, let's trade, but then you bring the queen out. At this point, your opponent may notice that this other pawn on d4 was left undefended, and they may wish to grab it. By the way, here's a quick rule about that. Do not overeat, it's unhealthy, right? Common sense, but it applies to chess just as well. If you are not sure what to do, do not capture too many pawns, because that makes you forget about main rules to develop and to castle. Or the other way I explain this is, if you're a driver, you know that they tell you when you're on the road, if you're not sure, don't overtake. And in chess, it's all the same stuff. If you're not sure, if you don't know an opening theory, do not overtake, do not take too many pawns. Just develop, instead play e6, bishop e7, and castle quickly, and you are good to go. Now, in the game instead, black, let's say, captured here. Now bishop e3, white gains one more tempo to develop a bishop. Black drops the queen to b4, trying to counterattack, but white castles. At this point, once again, black may realize that they may play bishop g4, skewing this queen and rook, and now it looks like on top of the pawns that they already gobbled up, they can grab the rook on d1. But here is a little bit important thing that black missed here. In order to castle quickly, you gotta develop your kingside pieces, right? This knight and this bishop. While in this game, black instead jumped around with their queen and with their bishop from the queenside, which does not prepare their castling at all. And what it means is that now white can take advantage of the centralized king, which cannot be castled anytime soon. And white can win the game with the move knight b5, aiming to grab this pawn. And in fact, there is no way for black to defend it. If they take on f3, knight takes c7, just wins the game because this rook cuts off this file, and in other variations, white are winning as well. Now let me share another example between two players. It's an online blitz game. White players rated 2400, black players rated 2300, so they both are quite advanced level players. Now white decided to go for this Smith-Morra gambit here in the Sicilian defense, and so far so good. Both sides are developing their pieces, and in this position played knight to e7. And again, black player is not a beginner, he's an advanced level player. Perhaps he has something in mind with this move. Maybe he wants to relocate the knight in the future to this nice square on e5, and that would indeed be nice. But there's one thing that black missed here. Remember, we talked about the fact that ideally you want to castle within the first 5 or 10 moves, and now it's already the 7th move, which is somewhat an alarming sign for black that, hey, your king is stuck in the center of the board for way too long. And by going knight to e7, black is slowing down development of their kingside, which is once again another alarming sign. So instead, black should have tried to develop these pieces as quickly as possible and to castle and to hide their king as quickly as possible. They instead played knight e7, which is not yet a decisive mistake, but after bishop g5, they decided to play h6 and get rid of this pin, which became already a decisive error. Instead of dropping the bishop away, white played knight to b5, and it turned out that stopping this knight takes d6 threat is very difficult for black, and black is already losing. In the game, they decided to go for it anyway, but now knight takes d6 is a check to the king. The knight is supported with the queen, therefore black cannot take it. That will lose the queen for black. And if instead black moves the king, white has a number of discovered checks here with the knight, something like knight takes f7, check to the king, and we can grab the queen on the next move and continue attacking. The 4th opening rule is to seize the initiative, which means that while developing your pieces and castling, ideally speaking, on top of that, you want to start creating little threats to your opponent. because even if your opponent can defend right now, this is the beginning of your attack and you're going to develop it gradually. For example, in the current position, instead of going for the two knights game or the Italian game, I personally love playing the f5 move in Blitz. Although it's not objectively speaking correct because it violates the development rule, right? Instead you gotta develop, but it starts creating those little threats to white. And right now it seems like no problem. White can defend this pawn in multiple different ways or can capture on f5. So again, it doesn't seem like white's in trouble at all. But that's not the point. Is by starting to create threats, you're gradually gaining the upper hand. You're forcing your opponent to defend, to obey your will, so to say, so that you can gradually develop your own attacking plan. For example, here after f5, lots of your opponents will realize that this threat is annoying and why not to capture this pawn on e4. Okay, now you play pawn e4, and actually pawn takes f5 was already run for white. Now, pawn e4, this knight has to go somewhere. At this point, white realizes that, hey, your queen is cutting off these squares, therefore the knight cannot go there. Your knight is taking away these two squares, therefore white can't go there either. And so they play the wrong move, knight to g1. I mean, there is a sacrifice knight to d4, but it's very difficult for white to find it if they're unfamiliar with this line, so they go back knight to g1. Now you go pawn to d5, and you gain one more tempo for your development. Let's say white decides, oh, besides moving the bishop, I can actually play this queen h5 check, which seems annoying for black, but you stay calm and you just keep developing. So king to e7, now the bishop needs to move back, and then you play knight f6, gaining, yes, one more tempo for your development. And now white feels uncomfortable because you can get back this pawn, so they play queen g5. And it's kind of similar to one of the games we analyzed previously, where white tries to hold on to this pawn and instead gives you a lot of tempos for your development. And after queen to g6, you can go knight d4 and grab this pawn anyway, thanks to the support of this knight. And your position is already really good, and you can see that it becomes better and better with every move. So let's say after white plays something, you play this bishop takes f5 move, attacking the queen, the bishop is supported, therefore the queen has to go, and now you can play king to f7, which will relocate a king to a better square, as well as prepare this development of the bishop. And it can actually be really powerful, because after knight e2 and let's say bishop d6 hitting the queen, if the queen goes somewhere, you can possibly even play g5 and capture it right away. And which brings us to another rule. People crack under pressure. Very often, even stronger players go wrong when you start creating threats. And that's how it is important for you to create those threats, because if you don't, well, your opponent will probably play normal moves. But as you create threats, your opponent is more likely to go wrong, plus you're seizing the initiative, forcing your opponent to do just things to stop your threats rather than doing things that he would love to do otherwise. Here's another interesting example for you how you can seize the initiative early in the game. Let's say your opponent plays all the same standard opening moves. You go knight f6, potentially attacking this pawn on e4, and if white develops their knight to c3 in order to defend this pawn, instead of just developing your bishop somewhere, you can play knight takes e4. It is not a sacrifice because after knight takes, you go d5 and you're gonna regain your piece on the next move. At the same time, objectively speaking, it doesn't give black anything. That was just an exchange. But the upside is, once again, you start creating problems for white. You start creating some possibilities for him to go wrong, and in most cases they will go wrong. The correct move here is bishop d3, which is less intuitive, giving away the knight, but most players will take the easy route and will play bishop takes d5, saying, hey, if I'm going to lose a piece, at least I'm going to get my pawn back. But now after queen takes d5, you're already attacking this knight, plus you occupy the center, what we talked about previously, and white is already in trouble. For example, if they want to defend their knight this way, now you can go bishop g4, pinning the knight down to the queen, and after, let's say, h3, bishop h5, it already feels uncomfortable. It's still not yet completely losing for white, but they're already feeling uncomfortable. In most cases, they'll try desperately to get rid of this pin and play g4, which, you know, yes, pushes the bishop back, but it weakens their position significantly, and now their position is probably already lost. Now you're also threatening this knight on e4, which is attacked twice. So in this game, we're analyzing, he played queen e2 to support the knight, black castled queenside, and now you also potentially threaten to attack these weaknesses. White decided to escape to the queenside, played bishop e3, but that blundered actually the central pawn, because bishop e3 covers the queen along the e-file, so black could grab it and win a pawn, plus he continues attacking. So that's how black could overtake here easily, and by the way, white player is rated 2500, not a beginner, but black could win the game easily by creating those little threats consecutively. So far we've been talking about main principles that you should follow in an opening. You gotta control the center, develop pieces, castle early, and if possible, seize the initiative. But we shouldn't forget about our opponent, as he has something in mind just as well. Here's one example. It's the Karakan defense, and let's say white goes bishop d3 to defend his pawn on e4. Let's say black decided to develop f9 d7. So far it's more or less standard, but now all of a sudden white decided to sacrifice his pawn on e6. And what happens, lots of players in such situations respond reactively. If they see that there is a threat, there's attacks, they think, okay, I'm gonna capture it. But instead, what you should do is to ask yourself, what's the plan of my opponent? Why did he decide to sacrifice a pawn for seemingly no big reason? And it turns out that in this position, after queen h5, it's actually a checkmate on the next move. And after g6, white can finish it in style with queen sack, followed by this bishop beautiful checkmate. In this position of the Sicilian defense, it was white to play, and white played this move pawn to a3. Black probably thought that it's just a waste of time, and lightheartedly decided to grab this pawn on b2. But instead, you already know, you gotta ask yourself, why is he playing this weird move a3? I mean, there are two possible reasons. Either he's just a beginner player, he doesn't know what he's doing and he's playing some weird move. But there is also the second opportunity, which is equally available, that your opponent is actually having something in mind. And in this case, black took here on b2, and it turned out that after knight to a4, the queen is trapped, and this pawn on a3 plays a key role. It takes away the final square where black's queen could possibly go to, and now black has to resign. In this position, it was white to play, and he played queen e2, attacking the knight. Most players in such cases just reactively drop the knight back to safety. But you gotta ask yourself, why is my opponent playing this slightly unusual move? I mean, queen on e2 blocks the bishop, it can be developed, and white neglects his own development. If he wanted to attack this knight anyway, he could do this with the bishop, which would be a more normal move development of the bishop. So why did he play queen e2? What does he have in mind? And it turns out that if you move the knight away, it leads to this beautiful smaller checkmate on e8 with this star from d6. And of course, black should not play knight f6, and instead he should care about his opponent's plans. Alright, now let's wrap this up, our entire quick crash opening course. So what do you do in an opening? First and foremost, you want to control these four central squares as much as you can. You want to occupy the center. The next idea is to develop your minor pieces quickly, meaning your knights and bishops should go out as quickly as possible. After that, and alongside with that, you also want to castle early in the game to put your king to safety. Ideally speaking, you want to do that within the first 5 moves, or at the very least within the first 10 moves, but that's gotta be a rule for sure. The next rule sees the initiative. If you can develop your pieces and along the way create threats to your opponent, that is ideal. This way, not only you develop, but you also start gaining the upper hand. Finally, you want to make sure that you understand the point of your opponent's moves, so that when your opponent moves something, you ask yourself what's the point of that move, and that makes sure that you don't blunder something. And the final piece of advice, one of the most common errors that make people forget about one of these rules and lose games quickly is overeating, right? If you're not sure what to do, remember that road analogy that we used. If you're not sure, not overtake, okay? For example, here, if you don't know an opening theory, just develop, castle, do all the usual stuff, right? Because when you start overeating and you don't know an opening theory, very often you can find yourself in this kind of a Stafford Gambit where black starts attacking and wins the game quickly. So that's what you do not want, and that is why do not overeat, just develop, castle, and seize the initiative.